This was one of the very early pictures, I think the third or fourth, that was made in a widescreen, Panavision in this case. I think maybe the first of Bob Gottschalk's Panavision lenses, which are pretty standard now, though Bob isn't around anymore. The people at Metro didn't really have any faith in CinemaScope or the concept of widescreen. They were enamored of 3D, which to me was the passing fancy, not widescreen, which is obviously the picture of the future. So then word came back from New York, make one in widescreen. They're doing business. So I rushed up and I said, now with the orders from New York, let me make one. And they said, you don't want to make this one. There's nobody in it. I said, what's that got to do with it? Well, to them, if you had widescreen, that meant thousands of extras, thousands of togas, amphitheaters with Christians being mauled by lions and so on. They said, what are you going to do with all this space? I said, well, the idea of a man, Tracy, in a black suit, standing against this empty space, doesn't that tell you something? Isn't that better the bigger the screen is? No, they didn't understand it. Anyhow, we made it, and I'm certainly glad we did. And the great, terrible problems of how do you do close-ups, well, obviously they weren't problems at all. It's a technique like making a film's technique. Films aren't real anyhow. People's close-ups, 20 feet high. Who's got a 20-foot head? They're flat. So it's technique. In line with the worries that Metro had about what are you going to do with all this space, how can you use it all with this widescreen process, they got more alarmed when they saw the set. Most Western streets were built solidly, row after row of building houses, streets with T's at the end, dead-end streets, because either they were on the back lot of the studio, and you couldn't show that, or the backgrounds were so uninteresting you didn't want to see them. This one, we took half the buildings out. We left spaces. Towns are like that. They're lots nobody ever built on. A town that got started and never grew, all to emphasize one of the key visual points. This one man in black against the emptiness of space and the loneliness of this tiny little town. In connection with cast, a very strange thing happened on the picture. It's supposed to be extras in a film. Towns are supposed to have wanderers in the distance, light traffic. So we had the usual group. I think there were 10 stock players and a handful of extras and a couple of little kids and so on. Well, in the film, there are none. Nobody but the cast. Every time my poor assistant director, Joel Freeman, would put somebody in, I didn't like it. It looked wrong. What's he doing out there? You have to be the audience if you want to be a director, and you're pretending, not pretending, you are the audience when you sit and watch. I went to this guy, and I said, who's that? Well, I didn't want anybody to look at him and say, who's that? So I got rid of him. Finally, Joel had them little dots in the distance. I said, that's worse. Are those the rescuers coming? There are no extras in this picture. A few people have said, what kind of town is this? Nobody ever goes by. Nobody apparently lives in it. Nobody's ever seen what kind of a town is it. I said, it's an imaginary town. It's a movie, not a town. And that didn't work, so I just took it out. And they said, well, you mean, how did you do that? And I said, you're God when you're a director. I just took it out. Like the famous story of Daryl Zanuck when he said, I've got it, I've got it, I've got it. He snatches a gun out from under the pillow in the bed and he shoots her. And one of the writers said, how did the gun get there? And Daryl said, I put it there. Well, that's making movies. Taking extras out like that, you might say, well, was it right or wrong? The answer to that is the film any good or not? Very successful film. I have to repeat that you are the judge when you watch a scene. Is it good or bad? If it's bad, what's wrong with it? If it's good, why is it? What would make it better? I know that as I watched those scenes, those people distracted me, spoiled the mood, and didn't work. And I'm a movie maker. It's not a documentary. So I just said, out. They strike me as wrong, so they're wrong. Now, I can't tell you what the picture would be like with them in. I can only tell you, thank God, it was a good picture without them. Watching Spence walk down this street in the beginning of this story, which is essentially a mystery story at the beginning. Who is this man? Why is he here? What does he want? You then start thinking about how the story is conceived and how you develop it to make a movie. It's all right to begin with a mystery. Who is he? Why is he here? But if you're going to keep people alive, you better have a reason that makes sense when you finally do divulge who he is and why he's here. Interesting aspect about this story, an original script was purchased based on a premise. The premise is a fact that if a man is given a decoration, particularly of any high order in a war, and there isn't an easy way to find his heirs or any member of his family, the government will hire a detective and they will go out and track this man down and rather track his parents or his family down and either give the medal to one of them or report back, can't be found. That was, to use a fancy word, the protagonist in the original script. Didn't fly. Sure, you didn't want to see the man get killed, but when it turned out he was just a detective doing a job, that's not the greatest surprise in the world. It didn't have, to use a fancy word, any identification, any fact, a protagonist motivates the story, and you identify with him, and he carries you along with him. So the original script was abandoned. Then a few months later, before I was ever involved in it, Dory Sherry, who was running Metro, but also a very talented writer with a long record, and Millard Kaufman, who wrote the screenplay, came up with two ideas. One, he was a man whose life was saved by a Japanese boy in Italy. The boy died. He was given a medal for his heroism. He's looking for the father of that boy to give him the medal and an expression of thanks. Two, he's lost the use of his arm. He feels mutilated, unneeded, defeated, and leading a pointless existence. Put those two elements in this, and you have a story. Then it moves, it's alive, and you identify, and it goes somewhere. In connection with the story, thinking about what it was supposed to do, what it meant, it was a good story. If a good story relates to something that's meaningful in people's lives and is important, well, then it's even better story. And that's what the underplay of what our country's about and what bigotry is was desirable. Now, the character that Spence plays senses the lack of truth. He senses from the moment he arrives something wrong here, something funny here. So that's the part of how you build a mystery story. How much does he know? What did happen? Is he telling everything he knows? This is the duel, the point and counterpoint of people fencing with each other. When you do a scene about blackmail, nobody uses the word blackmail. They tell you how nice it would be to go to the Caribbean. And you say, well, how much would that cost? You say, well, maybe $10,000. Nobody says, give me $10,000 or I'll tell. Neither of these people who are dueling, that is to say the part that Spence is playing, Bob is playing, are letting the other fellow know exactly what they know. And each is fishing to find out what the other knows. That's what makes these scenes play. If that wasn't true, they'd be just a hash of words. You'd say, get on with it, what's happening? Suspense is nothing's happening. The trick of suspense is to do nothing and make people sweat. That's what Hitchcock was so good at. The internment of the Japanese is simply a part of the mechanics of what made the story come to pass. If you start on the premise that the man who wrote the original story started on, if someone's going to get off in this town looking for the father of the boy who won the medal, obviously he's written letters, obviously they haven't been delivered, so obviously he's going to ask where he is, and obviously he was put in an internment camp, just as Ryan says. Putting Anne Francis in the film, or rather I should really say, writing a part for a girl that she played in the film, was in one sense unusual, the only girl in the cast. Another sense, back to what I said earlier. There's nobody in this picture that doesn't actively take a part in the picture. So there must have been other girls and women in that town. Where were they? Same place the people I kept saying, get rid of that man out there in the car, get rid of that woman hanging up the clothes. Took them out. She was the only girl of the 7 people that tell this story. That's the unusual thing. She was very good in it, I think. And that's all I can say about it. She was there because she was part of the story. There were no other girls like there were no other people. Stylized filmmaking. The people in the story represented isolation. Put them under a microscope and study them. Get rid of all extraneous detail that might confuse you. As I watch these scenes and the preoccupation with emptiness around the people, I'm reminded of another very important aspect of this story. The aspect that applies to many Western stories. It's always called a Western. It's not a Western. It took place in 1946 or 47. Isolation means you have to do it by yourself. You can't call for help because there isn't any help. Cut the lines, you can't call the police. So whatever's going to happen, whether it's murder or revolution or violence, it's going to have to be resolved right there. There's nobody to come help you. If you play a story like this one in teeming traffic in Los Angeles, it isn't going to work because all you have to do is stop the first fellow who walks by and says, get the police for me. Out here, we keep reminding you there's no help. There's nowhere to go. You can't walk away. You can't get away. Time is on you, and you must make it happen. That fight in which Spence clobbers Borgnine has been considered by a lot of people to be one of the best fights ever staged, which brings forward an interesting thing and the kind of thing you have to evaluate if you're a movie director. What makes a fight a good fight is how much you care who wins or loses. People can hit each other with axes walking up and down girders 50 stories in the air, and if you don't care about them, you know, you're going to get bored unless they go up in flames, and then you're going to get bored. The thing is how much you care who wins. The second is the reluctant hero. Spence plays the reluctant hero in this picture. He's not a guy going around trying to make waves, not trying to be the hero. He's trying to avoid trouble. He came there to find the Japanese guy and give him the medal. It's Borgnine who's pushing the fight. Deliberately, a scene was written, and I played it to the point, I think if it lasted another 10 feet, the audience would have shouted out in disgust that Spence didn't hit him. So you play it right up to that peak where if he doesn't hit him, you know, you're going to just yell. Then when you do, that kind of a fight, explode it. Let the guy that's going to win it just clobber the man and do it fast, because if you do it fast, a great cheer of relief and joy will go up. If you spin it out, they'll say we got what he had coming. That's not the same as that wow when he hit him. So that's the way we staged this thing. Ryan left the picture a vicious and frightening character. To bring him back captured dilutes that. I didn't want to ever see him alive again. I wanted to remember him when he burned up. I didn't want to see him brought back handcuffed. He's a diminished, meaningless character. So I called up the boys and said, he's got to die. I'm not going to bring him in captive. They said, fine. Directing pictures becomes a pretty easy job if the script's good. Half the time you spend trying to make the scenes play, trying to make the script work. This one, no strain. It was a beautiful script from beginning to end. I don't think we changed anything in it. We crossed out a couple of words. Sometimes a spoken line becomes a little stilted if it's read exactly as written. And when you say it naturally, you say it in an easier way. We would just do that. Other than that, didn't change a thing.